Sarah never imagined she'd be standing on the edge of a broken marriage, her world crumbling at the hands of the one person she had trusted most, Mark, her husband. But when she stumbled upon a secret hotel receipt, everything changed. Mark wasn't just her partner. He was hiding something far darker, something that would shatter their lives forever. What Sarah didn't know was that this discovery would not only expose a betrayal, but plunge her into a terrifying game of control, manipulation, and fear. A game where she might not be able to escape. Sarah and Mark Livingston appeared to have the kind of life everyone envied. They were the embodiment of success, their home a picture of suburban perfection. Their house was nestled on a quiet street, surrounded by well-maintained lawns and towering oak trees that painted a peaceful, almost idyllic picture. Mark worked as an executive at a prominent company, his career on a steady climb, while Sarah dedicated herself to their two children, Emma and Jack. She was the type of mother who volunteered at the school, attended every soccer game, and spent hours baking cookies for the neighborhood bake sale. To the outside world, they were the perfect family. Their relationship seemed to be equally flawless. They had been together for over 10 years, having met in college and quickly becoming inseparable. Mark was charming, the kind of man who could make anyone feel special with just a few words. He had always been successful with women, but Sarah believed she was the one who had captured his heart in a way no one else had. Their life was marked by family vacations, dinner parties with friends, and quiet nights in front of the television. It was the life most people dreamed of. Sarah trusted Mark completely. She admired how dedicated he was to his work, though there were times when she noticed a distance creeping between them. He seemed preoccupied lately, often distracted by his phone or working late into the night. The late nights became more frequent, and Sarah, though noticing the change, chalked it up to the pressure he faced at work. She told herself that it was just the demands of his career, and that once things settled down, he would return to being the attentive husband he always was. But as the weeks passed, the signs grew harder to ignore. Mark's phone was constantly buzzing, and when he wasn't home, he would take calls in private, his voice low and guarded. At first, Sarah convinced herself it was just business. But then came the late nights, nights when Mark would be working. Late, but his work had no clear end. He stopped making time for family dinners or helping the kids with homework. And when he did come home, his excuses seemed rehearsed, as if he were trying too hard to make things appear normal. Mark had always been a man who took pride in his appearance, but over the last few months, he had started wearing cologne more frequently and paying more attention to his grooming. It was the small changes that Sarah found unsettling. It wasn't like Mark to be so meticulous about his looks, especially when he was just coming home after a day at the office. She would ask him where he had been, and he would give vague answers, brushing her off with a smile. "Just a long meeting," he would say, or "I was with some colleagues." Sarah wanted to believe him. After all, she had no reason to doubt him, at least none that were concrete. But deep down, a nagging feeling began to grow. Sarah knew something was off. The warmth in their relationship, the kind that had always been so easy, was fading. She found herself spending more time alone, wondering if it was all in her head. The nagging suspicion grew, gnawing at her, yet she tried to push it aside. She loved Mark, and she wanted to believe that their marriage was built on a solid foundation of trust. One afternoon, as she was sorting through some paperwork in Mark's office, her eye caught a glimpse of something unusual. It was a receipt for a hotel booking, a place she recognized from a business trip Mark had taken recently. She didn't think much of it at first, but when she glanced at the date, she realized it didn't line up with anything he had told her. Her heart started to race, and her hands shook as she picked up the paper. She hesitated for a moment before opening it. It was a confirmation for a weekend stay at a hotel with a note written on the back, "Can't wait to see you again this weekend." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were chilling. It was a name Sarah didn't recognize. Vanessa. The discovery shattered her world in an instant. The life she had built, the trust she had in her husband, felt like a lie. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the weight of what she had uncovered settled in. She stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do next. The pieces of the puzzle she had been trying to make sense of suddenly clicked together with terrifying clarity. The late nights, the secrecy, the sudden change in Mark's behavior, all of it pointed to the same heartbreaking conclusion. Mark had been hiding something from her. Something far worse than just a secret. As Sarah stared at the receipt, her mind raced. She had always trusted Mark, believed in their love and the life they had created. But now, everything she thought she knew was called into question. The question that now burned in her mind was, how could he betray me like this? The moment Sarah discovered the hotel reservation, her entire world shifted. The details were clear and undeniable. She had never seen the name Vanessa before, but she knew instinctively that this was no coincidence. The message on the back of the receipt felt like a gut punch, and her mind raced to process the information. For hours, she walked through the house, her thoughts spiraling, unable to make sense of the devastation that was unfolding before her. She couldn't stop staring at the note, at the words that proved her worst fears were real. Her hands trembled as she tried to think clearly. What should she do next? How should she confront Mark? The anger inside her began to bubble up, mixing with a deep sense of betrayal. Mark had been her partner, her confidant, her best friend for over a decade. They had built a life together, and now all of that seemed like a lie. Sarah paced back and forth, unable to settle her mind. The kids were at school, and for the first time in years, the house felt completely silent. The only noise came from the sound of her heartbeat, quickening as the reality of the situation sank deeper into her bones. The image of Mark with Vanessa kept flashing in her mind. She didn't know what Vanessa looked like, but the thought of her husband with another woman twisted something inside her. How long had it been going on? Was this just a fling, or had he fallen in love with someone else? The questions overwhelmed her, and the uncertainty gnawed at her soul. She had trusted him, no, loved him, and now that trust was shattered beyond repair. How could he do this to their family, to their children, to her? She knew one thing for sure. She needed answers. The silence in the house was suffocating, and as the hours stretched on, she could feel her anxiety growing. Every time the phone buzzed or the door creaked, her stomach would drop, and her thoughts would spiral back to the discovery she had made. Mark would be home soon, and she couldn't bear the thought of confronting him, but she knew it was inevitable. The truth needed to be spoken, no matter how painful. When Mark finally walked through the door that evening, Sarah was sitting on the couch, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The usual warmth of his smile was absent. She could see the tension in his face, his eyes avoiding hers as he walked in. He didn't know it yet, but Sarah was about to tear down the walls of their marriage. As he dropped his bag by the door, he barely acknowledged her presence. The distant look on his face was enough to make her heart ache with confusion. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. Without looking away from him, she spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Who is Vanessa?" The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Mark froze, his expression faltering for just a moment before he quickly composed himself. Sarah could see the panic flicker across his face before he tried to hide it. But it was too late. She had already seen it. Mark stammered, his words stumbling, out in a desperate attempt to deflect. "Sarah, it's not what you think," he said, his voice shaky. "It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. It didn't mean anything, But Sarah wasn't listening. The floodgates of her emotions had opened, and she couldn't stop the rush of pain, confusion, and fury that overwhelmed her. She had already seen enough. His words felt empty, like they were just an attempt to minimize what he had done. "A moment of weakness," she repeated, her voice rising. "Mark, you've been seeing her behind my back. You've been lying to me. To our family. How long has this been going on?" Mark's face contorted with guilt, but the defensive wall he had built around himself was starting to crack. "It's been a few months, but I swear I never meant for it to get this far," he pleaded, stepping closer to her. "Sarah, I made a mistake. I've been lost, but you're the one I love. You're my family. This was just... I don't even know what happened." His words felt hollow to Sarah. She could feel the anger rising within her like an unstoppable wave. She had spent years supporting him, loving him unconditionally, and this was how he repaid her, with lies, deceit, and betrayal. She stood up, abruptly, unable to sit any longer. Her mind raced as she took a step back from him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and rage. "You think I'm just going to forgive you?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. She could feel her heart breaking with every word. "You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around behind my back, and now you want me to just forget it? I don't even know who you are anymore, Mark." Mark tried to reach for her, but she stepped away, holding her hands up as if to keep him at a distance. The anger and disbelief were overwhelming, drowning out any rational thought. "I can't do this. I can't live like this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're not the man I thought you were." As Mark stood there, desperately trying to find the right words, Sarah realized that nothing he could say would change the truth she had uncovered. The man she had built a life with, the man she had trusted more than anyone else, had betrayed her in the worst way possible. She couldn't fix this. She couldn't ignore it. And deep down, she knew this would be the breaking point of their marriage. She had discovered his affair, and now there was no going back. The days following Sarah's discovery of the affair were filled with tension, confusion, and heartache. She had confronted Mark, demanding answers, but now the reality of what she had uncovered began to sink in deeper. The truth was undeniable. Mark, the man she had trusted more than anyone in her life, had betrayed her in the most painful way possible. The anger she felt was consuming, but it was the deep sadness that lingered, gnawing at her from within, that seemed to drown out everything else. Mark, for his part, seemed to be walking a tightrope between desperation and guilt. He apologized again and again, each time more fervently than the last. He promised that the affair had meant nothing, that it was a fleeting mistake, and that he wanted nothing more than to repair their marriage. But Sarah wasn't listening. His words felt empty, rehearsed, and insincere. She could no longer trust anything he said. The more he begged for forgiveness, the more she resented him. Mark would often try to approach her after work, bringing flowers or gifts, things he knew would normally melt her heart. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to accept any of it. Every gesture felt like a slap in the face. How could he possibly think that material things could erase what he had done? How could he think that he could just apologize his way back into her heart after everything had been shattered? It wasn't just the affair that stung. It was the betrayal of their entire life together. All the years they had spent building their family, raising their children and supporting each other suddenly seemed like a lie. How could she look at Mark the same way again? How could she ever trust him? The weight of these questions pressed heavily on her as she navigated through each day, her mind constantly churning with thoughts of their broken marriage. The kids, Emma and Jack, were completely unaware of the turmoil in their home. They continued their routines as though nothing had changed, oblivious to the fracture in their parents' relationship. Sarah kept a brave face for them, but inside she felt like she was falling apart. She couldn't even look at Mark without seeing the image of him with Vanessa, the woman who had been the catalyst for this entire nightmare. At night, Sarah would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. She replayed every moment with Mark, trying to pinpoint when things had gone wrong, when he had started to pull away from her, but she couldn't find a clear answer. Mark had always been so good at hiding things, so adept at pretending everything was fine. He had made her feel like she was crazy for questioning him, gaslighting her into thinking that her suspicions were nothing more than insecurity. But now, with the truth staring her in the face, she realized that the whole time she had been right. Something had been terribly wrong. As the days passed, Sarah felt herself growing colder, more distant from the man she had once loved. She couldn't bring herself to forgive him, not when the wounds were so fresh and so deep. There were moments when she wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much he had hurt her, but she kept silent instead. She didn't need to say anything more. The silence between them spoke volumes. Mark, on the other hand, couldn't seem to grasp the magnitude of what he had done. He was still trying, in his own way, to fix things. He wanted to be the man Sarah could love again, but he had no idea how to get there. He thought that time would heal their wounds, that Sarah would eventually come around. But deep down, he feared that she would never forgive him, that the distance between them was now too great to overcome. Sarah, for her part, began to plan for the future without him. She wasn't sure what that would look like yet, but she knew that things could never go back to the way they were. The trust had been broken beyond repair, and that was something she couldn't undo. She couldn't imagine continuing her life with someone who had so easily thrown everything away for a fleeting affair. As the days wore on, Sarah began to realize that her decision was inevitable. She had no choice but to move on. She couldn't keep living in a marriage that had been shattered by lies and deceit. But even as she prepared herself to let go, there was still a small part of her that mourned the loss of the life they had once shared. The life that now seemed like a distant memory. But there was no more room for hope. There was no more room for forgiveness. She had discovered the affair, and that discovery had changed everything. The days following the confrontation seemed to stretch endlessly for Sarah. Mark had been trying to reach her, attempting every tactic he could think of to regain her trust. He called her multiple times each day, left endless apologetic messages, and even wrote heartfelt letters. but none of it moved her. His words felt meaningless now, like empty promises from a man who had already betrayed her once. She found herself growing more detached by the minute, unable to see the man she had once loved through the fog of his deceit. Sarah spent her days consumed with a whirlwind of emotions. She would wake up in the morning with a deep pit in her stomach, dreading the inevitable interactions with Mark. She still loved him, or at least she thought she did. But the betrayal had changed everything. Every time she looked at him, she was reminded of the lies. Her heart ached as she realized that everything they had built together was based on a foundation of deception. She began to feel numb. There were no more late-night talks, no more shared moments of quiet intimacy, no more of the trust that had once bound them. It was as though the man she had spent a decade of her life with had disappeared, replaced by someone who felt like a stranger. She wanted to walk away from it all, but a part of her still held on to the hope that he could change, that he could become the man she had thought he was. But as time passed, Sarah started to feel an unsettling shift within herself. She realized that her anger was growing. She had been trying to rationalize it, trying to figure out why Mark had done what he did, but the truth was there was no acceptable reason. His affair wasn't just a mistake. It was a conscious decision to betray her, to hurt her, and that hurt had festered inside her, turning into something far darker than she had anticipated. Mark's persistent attempts to patch things up only seemed to make it worse. He was relentless, coming home early, hoping to catch her when she wasn't busy. He tried to show her affection, to hold her hand, to apologize with tears in his eyes. But it wasn't working. Sarah had built up a wall around her heart. A wall that was now impenetrable. She couldn't be fooled again. His actions had already done irreversible damage, and no amount of remorse could undo the pain he had caused. It wasn't just the affair that devastated her. It was the way Mark had treated her afterward. He thought that if he apologized enough, if he begged enough, things would return to normal. But normal wasn't an option anymore. The man she had once trusted had shattered that version of their life. And yet she could see how he struggled. The guilt in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. He was trying, but it was all too little. Too late. As the days wore on, Sarah began to grow more and more disillusioned. Her thoughts turned darker as she began to entertain the idea of what her life might look like without Mark. She wasn't sure when the tipping point had come, but something inside her began to break. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that leaving wasn't just an option, it was the only option. She couldn't live in a constant state of emotional turmoil. She couldn't keep pretending that things could go back to how they were. But as Sarah started to mentally prepare herself for the idea of leaving Mark, something changed within him. His desperation reached a new level. He no longer seemed just regretful. He seemed frantic. Mark began to threaten things, not outright, but in subtle, manipulative ways. He talked about how he couldn't live without her, how he couldn't survive the thought of losing her. But it wasn't his love that was making Sarah uneasy. It was the fear in his eyes, the sense that his world was collapsing. Mark was a man, used to control, and in this moment he was losing it all. The coldness Sarah had been feeling started to seep deeper, turning her thoughts darker still. She had spent weeks wrestling with the idea of leaving him, torn between anger, hurt, and a strange loyalty to their past. But as Mark's pleas turned into something more unsettling, she realized she was no longer just emotionally disconnected. She was scared. It wasn't that she feared Mark would hurt her physically, but his emotional manipulation began to weigh on her. He would do anything to keep her, he told her. He would change. He would become the man she wanted, but only if she stayed. She began to wonder just how far he would go to prevent her from leaving him, how far he was willing to push before she could break free. As Mark's obsession with keeping their family intact grew, Sarah's fear started to turn into something else entirely. She could no longer ignore the growing sense of danger. The man she had trusted, the man who had promised to stand by her side forever, had become someone unrecognizable. She was now faced with a chilling reality. Mark might do anything to protect his life with her, even if it meant keeping her trapped in a marriage that was suffocating her. Mark's desire to maintain the facade of a perfect life was becoming darker by the day. It wasn't just about saving their marriage anymore. It was about preserving his image, his reputation. As his desperation mounted, Sarah began to understand the dangerous path their relationship was heading down. The more she thought about it, the more she realized she might have to take drastic steps to protect herself, not just from the emotional scars, but from something much more dangerous. And yet, she didn't know how far Mark was willing to go. The days turned into weeks, and the weight of uncertainty grew heavier on Sarah's shoulders. Every conversation with Mark seemed to be a game of emotional manipulation, each interaction more suffocating than the last. He had become unpredictable, one moment pleading for forgiveness, the next trying to guilt her into staying. But it wasn't just his words that frightened her anymore. It was the look in his eyes, the dark desperation creeping into his every movement. Sarah could feel the walls closing in, and a deep, gnawing instinct told her that she was in danger. At first, it was small things. The way he started to follow her around the house, hovering just a little too closely when she was on the phone with friends. The way he would question her every move, demanding to know where she was going or who she was seeing. She tried to push it aside, convincing herself it was just his guilt and fear talking, but deep down, something inside her knew it wasn't just that. He was slipping into a darker version of himself, one that she had never seen before, and it terrified her. Mark's behavior continued to escalate in subtle but frightening ways. He started showing up at places where she hadn't told him she would be, as if he were keeping tabs on her. Once he showed up at the grocery store just as she was picking out some produce, his face grim and distant. Sarah had been startled at first, but Mark simply shrugged it off, claiming it was a coincidence. But it wasn't. It was the second time in a week he had shown up at places she hadn't mentioned to him, and the fear began to take hold in Sarah's chest. The constant surveillance made her feel trapped in her own life, suffocated by a man who, just a few months ago, had been her partner. She could feel her sanity slipping away, inch by inch. She couldn't breathe freely without him watching her, every move. The emotional manipulation had shifted into something much more sinister, and Sarah knew she could no longer ignore it. One night, after Mark had begged her once again to stay, promising that he had changed, something in Sarah snapped. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, especially when she could feel the danger lurking beneath his words. The emotional weight of the past few weeks had worn her down, but now, the terror she felt in her own home had reached a tipping point. She needed to get out. The plan was simple, but terrifying. She didn't know if Mark would let her go, or if he would try to stop her. But she couldn't wait any longer. Sarah packed a bag late that night, gathering what she could carry. She left behind the life she had known for so many years, the life that had seemed perfect on the surface, but had been built on lies and betrayal. As she slipped out the back door, her heart pounded in her chest. She was leaving the man she had once loved, the father of her children, but she knew there was no other choice. For the next few days, Sarah stayed with a close friend. She didn't tell Mark where she was going, and she didn't answer his desperate calls. She needed time to think, to regain some sense of control over her life. But even as she stayed with her friend, the unease never left her. Every knock on the door made her jump. Every strange car passing by her friend's house made her stomach twist. She knew Mark wouldn't stop looking for her. He had too much to lose. And in his mind, he would do anything to keep his family intact, even if it meant forcing Sarah to stay. On the third day, Sarah received a call. It was a blocked number, but she recognized the voice immediately. It was Mark. His voice was shaking, pleading with her to come back. He told her he had made arrangements to go to therapy, that he was willing to do whatever it took to save their marriage. But Sarah heard something else in his voice, a desperation that chilled her to the core. It wasn't just guilt. It was something darker, something more dangerous. She hung up without saying a word, her mind made up. She couldn't go back. She couldn't live in fear, in the constant shadow of Mark's obsession. He had crossed a line, and now it was her turn to protect herself and her children from the man he had become. In the weeks that followed, Sarah took the necessary steps to ensure her safety. She filed for separation, and when Mark showed up at her friend's house one evening, pleading with her to give him another chance, she was ready. The police were called. The restraining order was placed. Mark, despite his desperate pleas and promises to change, was now legally barred from coming near her. The relief Sarah felt in those moments was overwhelming. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. The divorce proceedings would be long and painful, and she still had to figure out how to rebuild her life, but she had taken control. She had chosen to protect herself, to stop being the victim of someone else's manipulations. The life she had once known, the life with Mark, was now a distant memory. But as Sarah looked toward the future, she knew that despite the pain and fear she had endured, she had survived, and that survival meant she could finally beg,